In December 1987, on a strip of Mediterranean coast overcrowded with refugees, a group calling itself the Islamic Resistance Movement was founded. In Arabic, its acronym spelled a word meaning zeal, HAMAS. Its goal was simple. It wanted to liberate historic Palestine. Until 1948, the majority of the people living there were Palestinian, but 750,000 of them were driven from their homes, never allowed to return. At least 450 of their towns and villages were emptied, and in their place, the State of Israel was founded. In 1967, Israel occupied the remaining parts of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and it was in Gaza that Hamas was born. There's been a lot of interest in Hamas and its goals since the group launched the biggest attack inside Israel on October 7th, 2023. Politicians and pundits like reducing complex issues to simple binaries of good and evil.
Hamas is a brutal terrorist organization.
They're a bunch of medieval barbarians.
Unleashing pure, unadulterated evil.
They are not freedom fighters.
To a lot of people, though, they are. So we're going to talk to an expert who will help us understand why they would think that, what Hamas wants, and how it's changed in the 35 years since it was founded.
My name is Tariq Bakoni. I'm a writer. I'm the author of Hamas Contained: The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance.
Hamas was formed by and appealed to people who had been expelled by Israel from their homes.
Hamas as a movement is a nationalist movement first and foremost. So it's a movement that is committed to the liberation of Palestine from Israeli colonization. The movement has never engaged in any activities or operations outside the land of historic Palestine.
Hamas grew out of the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, which had initially focused on charity work and education rather than confronting Israeli occupation. It was secular nationalists and leftists under the exiled Palestine Liberation Organization who led that fight. The PLO is recognized by the UN as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, but in December 1987, without PLO input, a mostly unarmed uprising, known as the First Intifada, began against Israel in Gaza and the West Bank. Hamas declared its existence 2 days into this rebellion. It's worth taking a moment here to address something. Because Hamas has an Islamic identity and Israel proclaims itself a Jewish state, a lot of people claim its animosity towards Israel is based on anti-Semitism. Bakoni says that's not accurate.
This is a fundamental misreading of Hamas and of Hamas's politics. It has not employed tactics that are grounded in anti-Semitism or that necessarily fight against Israeli Jews because of their Judaism. So when we think about Hamas discussing the liberation of Palestine, what it means for the movement is dismantling a system of colonial violence.
This was also addressed by Hamas's founder, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin.
احنا ما بنكره اليهود وبنقاتل اليهود لانهم يهود. اليهود اهل دين واحنا اهل دين. اخويا هذا اللي من امي وابويا اللي دينه مسلم اذا اخذ بيتي وطردني منه انا بقاتله.
In 2017, the group addressed this in its updated charter, we'll get to that later, saying, quote, Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. The First Intifada ended with the 1993 Oslo Accords between Israel and the PLO. The PLO gave up its claim to historic Palestine, renounced violence, and recognized the State of Israel. In exchange, a Palestinian authority run by the PLO would have limited autonomy over some parts of the occupied West Bank and Gaza. The right of return for refugees would be discussed in future negotiations that were meant to lead to a Palestinian state in just the West Bank and Gaza. While many Palestinians saw this as a hopeful moment, others felt that the PLO had given up too much for too little. Hamas was among those opponents, and its members were persecuted by both Israel and the PA. But its opposition wasn't just verbal. Hamas's military wing is known as the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam Brigades.
When Hamas constituted itself in 1987 as the movement we understand today, it re-emerged through the social infrastructure as a military movement. So it began amassing weapons in order to commit to resisting Israel.
After an American-Israeli settler killed 29 Palestinians at a mosque in Hebron, Hamas responded with what would become its signature tactic for the next decade: a suicide bomb. Deadlier and more dramatic than shooting soldiers, these attacks had two goals. One was the disruption of the Oslo Accords. And two, by expanding its targets to include Israeli civilians, Hamas hoped it would pressure the Israeli government to end the occupation. But these tactics were controversial, even among Palestinians and even within Hamas itself.
So there was a lot of discussion internally amongst Palestinians about the morality of targeting civilians. Of course, under international law, targeting civilians is illegal. However, the Palestinians were operating in a reality where the violence of the apartheid structure itself was targeting civilians day in, day out, with no accountability. And Hamas at the time believed that inflicting at least some damage on Israeli civilians was a way of deterrence.
But when a second intifada broke out in 2000, Hamas and other groups deployed dozens of suicide bombers, killing more than 1,000 Israelis. Instead of deterrence, these attacks gave Israel cover as it decimated Gaza and the West Bank, killing more than 4,900 Palestinians. After that uprising died down in early 2005, Hamas pretty much abandoned suicide bombings, but it didn't abandon armed opposition to Israeli occupation. And the next few years would see the group evolve in major ways, both militarily and politically. From its founding to the end of the Second Intifada, Hamas had been an opposition movement, but as the Palestinian Authority's negotiations with Israel failed to create a Palestinian state or even stop Israel from building more settlements, Hamas's popularity grew. The US, European Union, and Israel consider the group to be a terrorist organization, but the UN and most other countries do not, and soon Hamas would become the central actor in resistance to Israel. From a small fighting force to a guerrilla army, from rebels to rulers. How did that happen? In 2005, Israel disengaged from Gaza and pulled its settlers and soldiers out. Israel claimed it was now no longer responsible for the people who lived in Gaza. But the withdrawal didn't end the occupation. Israel still dominated the territory from the outside, controlling borders, trade, telecommunications, the sky, the sea. But the settlements were gone. So Hamas, which had been attacking the Gaza settlements and military bases, saw it as a vindication. In its view, armed resistance was the way to get rid of Israeli settlements. In 2006, looking to play a bigger role in Palestinian politics, Hamas took part in Palestinian Authority legislative elections. This was a big change. Hamas had boycotted the previous elections, saying elections under Israeli occupation were part of the Oslo process it opposed. Now, it claimed that the collapse of Oslo meant things were different. And to many people's surprise, it beat President Mahmoud Abbas's ruling Fatah party in both Gaza and the West Bank.
Rather than respect the results of the democratic election, the US, supported by Israel, decided to engage in a regime change operation. So essentially it began to facilitate for a coup to prevent Hamas from emerging as a governing authority that was democratically elected.
Israel arrested enough of the newly elected Hamas members in the West Bank to prevent the legislature from functioning, while in Gaza, months of deadly street fighting between Abbas's US-backed security forces and Hamas loyalists left hundreds of people dead. Until June 2007, when the Qassam brigades routed the security forces and expelled them from Gaza. Within 2 years, Gaza had gone from being controlled by the Israeli military to being controlled by Hamas.
Now, in response, Israel tightened a blockade that had already been placed on the Gaza Strip in different iterations in the past. And in its initial thinking, Israel used the blockade as a punitive tool, really to punish the Palestinians and to try to force them to bring down Hamas as a governing authority.
The blockade has had a huge impact on Gaza, with 80% of its factories shutting down since it began. Unemployment is at least 46%, and travel, fuel, electricity, and medical aid have all been restricted. But isolating Gaza like this also served other Israeli goals. For a long time, Israeli governments have wanted to remove Gaza's population from the country's demographic equation.
And getting rid of this demographic problem would allow Israel to maintain itself as a quote-unquote Jewish majority state.
That's because when you include Gaza's population, there are actually as many, if not more, Arabs living under Israeli rule as there are Jews. But to keep Gaza separate, Israel has relied on what Bocconi calls a violent equilibrium with Hamas. Here's how it worked. When conditions in Gaza have become especially difficult, Hamas has often fired rockets at Israel. The response has often been a massive Israeli assault, after which a ceasefire is negotiated and some restrictions lifted for a while. There have been several major assaults in 2008 and 2009, 2012, 2014, and in 2021, which have killed more than 4,000 people in Gaza. On the Israeli side, less than 100 people were killed. Israeli officials have referred to this endless cycle of siege and violence as mowing the grass.
Now, this violent equilibrium relied on the premise that there doesn't need to be a political resolution to the Gaza Strip, that Israel could deal with it only militarily, and that the blockade could continue indefinitely, regardless of the fact that it was premised on collective punishment and the forced imprisonment of 2 million Palestinians.
Back in 2012, the UN warned that unless the blockade was lifted, Gaza would be uninhabitable by 2020. Meanwhile, with Gaza separated from the West Bank, Israel had a freer hand to expand its illegal settlements over there. For the sake of the millions living under its rule, and for its goal of ending Israeli colonization and occupation, Hamas looked for a solution.
There were several efforts, actually, politically, by Hamas and by the Palestinian Authority to try to achieve a reality whereby the Palestinian Authority would come back into the Gaza Strip and there would be reconciliation or some form of unity.
A 2017 deal saw Hamas actually give up some of the ministries it was running, with the PA taking over, although Hamas has always kept exclusive security control in Gaza.
But all forms of dealing with the political reality around the Gaza Strip were opposed by Israel.
In an attempt to gain more international legitimacy and create some diplomatic openings, Hamas updated its charter in 2017. The new charter produced a significant development in the group's thinking. While it still hoped to liberate all of historic Palestine, Hamas accepted that a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank, along with the return of refugees to their homes, was a solution that Palestinians could agree on. Now, this is in line with the policies of many countries around the world who want to see a two-state solution.
Now, for the Western policymaking community, this did not go far enough, but the movement certainly provided significant ways in which it could engage in diplomacy with Western powers. And instead of engaging with that, Western powers decided to maintain a blockade on Hamas.
A year later, Hamas backed a massive, almost 2-year-long protest called the Great March of Return on Gaza's eastern boundary with Israel. Every Friday, thousands of Palestinians marched unarmed to the fence, demanding the right to return to their ancestral homes.
Israel's response was to portray these popular marches as a form of terrorism, and they employed snipers hidden in sand dunes around the Gaza Strip, which targeted civilians, medics, and journalists. 214
Palestinians were killed and 36,000 injured. But
the popular mobilization resulted in very basic coverage globally and no concessions at all from Israel.
Speaking to an Italian newspaper that year, Hamas's leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, who spent 22 years in Israeli jails before being released in a 2011 prisoner swap, said he was hoping for a long-term ceasefire that would end the siege. "If you know war, you don't want war," he said. "I'm not saying I won't fight anymore. I'm saying I want no more wars. I want the end of the siege."
All the tactics that Hamas has employed, whether diplomatic or popular, have not been met with any kind of concession or even engagement from either the Israeli authorities or from the international community.
Instead, as the occupation and blockade became more entrenched and human rights groups declared Israel was committing apartheid against Palestinians, Israeli leaders felt little pressure to change course. Hamas seemed contained. If it did fight, Israel's defense technology kept its losses manageable. The West Bank and Gaza were now separated for a generation, and the Palestinian cause seemed like it was dying. The US was focused on building alliances between Arab countries and Israel, even as Israeli elections brought fascists to power. On September 29, 2023, the US National Security Advisor said,
"And the Middle East region is quieter today than it has been in 2 decades."
8 days later, Hamas fighters broke out of Gaza, launching the attack that changed all of that. Hundreds of Israelis, civilians and soldiers, were killed and more than 200 taken hostage to be bargained for in a prisoner swap. But the Israeli response has been devastating, wiping out entire neighborhoods. At the time of recording, 1 out of every 30 people in Gaza had been killed, wounded, or was missing as airstrikes hit homes, hospitals, schools, mosques, and universities. Even water, food, fuel, and electricity have been cut off. So, is this the end of Hamas? After 35 years of fighting Israel, building a political program, evolving into a ruling government, and attempting to break the siege, has the group signed its own death warrant? That seems to be what Israel and its supporters believe, although 2 months into the fighting, there wasn't much evidence of Hamas collapsing. But can Israel's ferocious bombing actually eliminate violent resistance from an oppressed community?
More than anything else, the movement, Hamas, is an ideology.
Whatever you think of its tactics, Hamas's popularity and its primary reason for existing is because of its fight against Israeli occupation.
The commitment to liberation through armed struggle is not going to go anywhere as long as the Palestinian people exist.
Clearly, there won't be a return to the status quo before October 7th, 2023. But breaking that status quo is exactly what Hamas intended when it carried out such a devastating attack.
The only way that Israel can get any form of calm or security is if it begins dealing with the Palestinian people, not through a military lens, but rather through a political lens, to see and acknowledge the political demands at the heart of the Palestinian Liberation Project, the most fundamental of which is the right of return of Palestinian refugees who have been expelled from homes now within Israel.